Hi, I'm Joe Truini, and I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to route rabbet joints using a simple shop-made jig. A rabbet is simply an L-shaped notch that's cut in the edge or the end of a board. It's sized to accept a mating board. It simply fits into the rabbet. The depth of a rabbet is typically half the thickness of the board, and the width of the rabbet equals the thickness of the mating piece. When viewed from the front, the board is concealed within the rabbet joint. The two pieces can either be glued together only, or if fasteners used, they're driven through the rabbeted board. Rabbet joints are popular in all types of cabinetry, all sizes and styles, including small jewelry boxes like the one we have here. Rabbet joints were used to join the front and the back to the sides. Rabbets were also cut in the bottom edges of all four pieces to accept the plywood bottom. The plywood bottom sets into the rabbets and leaves a nice clean look to the box. If I were to orient the box this way, you could see that the same joinery could be used for building a wall-hung cabinet, which is what I'm working on today. The drawing I have here on the wall shows the cabinet we're working on. The cabinet measures 16 inches wide by 28 inches high. The sides of the cabinet are rabbeted on the ends to receive the cabinet top and bottom. All four pieces are also rabbeted along the back edge to receive a 1/4 inch plywood back. Now let's take a closer look at how the jig works. It consists of four pieces: two side rails, a fence, and a stop block. In use, the fence rides along the edge of the workpiece. The router sits in here and is held tightly against the stop block. There are two main advantages to using this jig. The first is that you only need to make one adjustment, and that's the depth of cut on the router. In this case, it was 3/8 of an inch deep for 3/4 inch stock. The other advantage is that you only need to use a standard straight bit. You don't need to buy a more expensive rabbeting bit, and you don't have to fuss with changing ball bearing pilots. The width of cut is determined by the distance between the fence and the edge of the stop block. In this case, the width of cut is 3/4 of an inch. I typically use this jig in conjunction with two others. The only difference being the distance from the fence to the stop block, which varies by 1/4 inch from one jig to the next. This allows me to cut a 3/8 inch deep by 3/4 inch rabbet in 3 stages, rather than trying to plow out all the waste in one single pass. The alternative to building all 3 jigs is to simply build the widest cutting jig, and then make 2 shims. One is 1/2 inch thick, and the other 1/4 inch thick. Insert the thicker shim and make the first pass to cut a 1/4 inch wide rabbet. Then replace it with the second thinner shim to cut the second pass and form a 1/2 inch wide rabbet. The third and final pass is made without any shims to complete the 3/4 inch wide rabbet. Okay, now let me show you how I made the jig. First I cut the parts to length, and then I notched the side rails to accept the 1 inch wide fence. I usually make the fence out of hardwood. If you use plywood, I recommend covering with plastic laminate to create a durable surface. I also notch the fence before I attach it to give clearance for the bit. The fence is attached with glue and finishing nails. The distance between the rails is a couple inches wider than the base plate on the router. Then you cut the stop block to fit between the rails. And to determine the distance from the fence to the stop block, you must measure the distance from the cutting edge of the bit to the edge of the base plate. In this case, it's 2.5 inches. Then you add 1/4 of an inch, or whatever you want your width of cut to be. You add that. In this case, it's 2 3/4 of an inch, and that's where you fasten the stop block. Clamp it and make a test cut in a scrap board to make sure it's in the right position. Then simply trim off the rails and glue and nail the stop block in place. I've got one more cut to make, and that's for the plywood back. And for that, I'll use the 1/4-inch jig. I start with the jig held firmly against the edge of the workpiece and the router against the left-hand rail, with the bit clear of the workpiece. I advance the jig and the router across the board to approximately the middle. Then I switch hands and use my left hand to push the jig and router through to the end of the cut. If this were an end rabbet cut across the grain, I would have begun by making a small back cut to prevent tear-out. Okay, one other thing that these jigs are great for is routing hinge mortises. Let me show you how I set up for that. For this cabinet, we're going to be installing an inset door, and I've selected a hinge that has a 3/4 by 2.5 inch wide leaf. First thing you need to do is mark the position of the hinge on the cabinet side, about 3 inches down from the end of the board. To route the mortise, we're going to be using the 3/4 inch jig. You'll notice on the fence here I've got 2 marks that represent the width of cut. You simply align the first mark with the hinge line and then clamp it in place. Since the travel is 2 3/4 inches and our hinge is only 2.5 inches, we need to reduce the width of cut by 1/4 of an inch. And I do that by inserting a 1/4 inch shim, clamping it in place. And now when I route the mortise, the result will be a 3/4 inch deep by 2.5 inch long mortise. If your hinge is wider than the travel between the jig, what you need to do is clamp 2 stop blocks to the workpiece on either side of the jig, and then the travel between the stop blocks will cut the desired length mortise. I hope that these jigs prove as useful to you as they have to me over the years.